I'm here right now with Ramsey Sprague. He's also one of the spokespeople for the Tar Sands Blockade movement, and you guys have been some of the busiest activists around lately. But you're here specifically to tell us a story of your home city of Houma and what happened and why you got involved into the movement. Give us a little background.
Right. Well, I was born in Houma, Louisiana. My family is from a little further south of there in a town called Dulac. These are primarily Indian areas occupied by folks like the Houma Nation and the Biloxi-Chitmacha Confederation. My particular familial heritage in the area is Biloxi-Chitmacha Confederation, and specifically the Grand-Caillou-Dulac band. And having grown up knowing that I was Native American, but not being extraordinarily connected to my culture or to Louisiana or my family there, I always just kept my heart very oriented towards the stories I was told in elementary school and middle school and high school about American history and where my family and my people fit in. I traveled to Guatemala pursuing closer relationship to the Indigenous here in Texas that I feel by and large speak Spanish. So went to Guatemala to learn Spanish and fell in love with Guatemala to the extent that I stayed there for 7 months and organized in the rural countryside and learned about Canadian extraction companies doing some really horrendous extraction policies like cyanide leaching with gold mines. They would take an entire hillside and crush it into a pulp and then run cyanide through it, and the liquid that would come out would contain dissolved gold. And that's how they got these gold mines up and running. Of course, the cyanide is very volatile and ends up in the water supply.
Right, exactly. How did they dispose of that cyanide?
I'm not an expert on the process, but I did meet a lot of Indigenous people in the highlands who the highlands were not their traditional lands. They were actually forced into the highlands after years of civil war and conquest and colonialization of the more fertile Boca Costa and the coffee regions. So these are displaced peoples already who are being further displaced by what is now sought underneath the mountains in these dry highlands. The water is completely crucial, and that's why they settled around these springs in these particular areas. And the gold mines are the practice of the gold mines and the dynamiting of the land not only destroys their homes, but has sucked the wells dry to the extent that they have to have water trucked in. And the water that flows is now contaminated, and other villagers and other areas and the surrounding areas won't buy their produce, and their animals and crops are failing because of the contamination. And there's a lot of violence that occurs in protection of the gold mines, and these are Canadian companies.
So you have seen firsthand in the third world countries the destructive practices that are going on, especially for people who can't really protect themselves or gain from any of this profit. Is that right?
Precisely. Just to put a name to it, San Miguel Ixtahuacan is the community that I've visited. And the gold mine there is called the Marlin Mine. It's a terrible thing to see.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
So, of course, when the opportunity arose here in Texas, where I was raised, to stand up to a Canadian extraction company that was contaminating Indigenous people in Canada, I jumped at the opportunity and began organizing with Tar Sands Blockade in a very serious and full-on way in East Texas, building our campaign of civil disobedience against the construction of the Keystone XL Pipeline, which is designed to facilitate an expansion of the exploitation of the tar sands in Alberta, Canada.
Why? Do the supporters of the pipeline think it's important to bring this tar sands oil, as it is, all the way across the United States to factories here in Texas. Why is that their deal?
The refining capacity of Houston and Port Arthur is massive. It's the largest refining capacity in the continent and one of the largest in the world. To be able to bring massive amounts of tar sands bitumen from Canada to here would allow for the expansion of the rate of exploitation of these strip mines that are contaminating massive swaths of land in Alberta, Canada. The process, of course, is really alarming, and you can go to dirtytarsands.org and see just endless images of the destruction, which are very haunting and unbelievable to a great extent.
Of course, we have been hearing a lot about a lot of the things that the activists have been doing. Diane, of course, in her hunger strike, and Bobby Lindsay, and it is truly seems to be a grassroots movement. Are you beginning to feel, I mean, here we are in the oil patch, but are you beginning to feel that people are kind of saying, yeah, you're right? Are you getting support, especially from these landowners in East Texas?
Absolutely. Actually, well before we began organizing as Tar Sands Blockade, there were groups that were from East Texas, most notably STOP, which is an acronym for Stop Tar Sands Oil Permanently. That group did a lot of grassroots outreach all up and down the length of the pipeline, the proposed route of the pipeline, and created this more or less this bed of acceptance for what was to come should the pipeline start construction.
Right.
So when the pipeline started and our acts of civil disobedience began, it wasn't an entirely unforeseen circumstance in East Texas, and we found a tremendous amount of support in the local communities therein, where STOP has done a lot of work and outreach educating the local population. Of course, public officials remain very silent or pro KXL, but the public by and large, from business owners to grandmothers and sewing circles, are very aware that this pipeline is a bad deal. And regardless of political orientation, left or right, conservative or liberal, they find themselves knowing and believing that this pipeline is a raw deal for not only East Texas, but for everybody.
Are you, speaking, I guess, from yourself, for yourself, are you surprised at the turn of President Obama's now forceful belief that the pipeline should continue? Is this a surprise to you all after the election?
No. We at Tar Sands Blockade saw the writing on the wall a long time ago and began organizing independently of some of the larger green NGOs that tend to think of themselves more as Democratic Party strategists and didn't stand up to President Obama when he endorsed and expedited the southern leg in an election year. It's very unfortunate that occurred, but it's very fortunate that people like us were there to step into that void and begin doing the organizing that these groups completely neglected. Like I said, the area was ripe for funds, for legislative action to come in and begin actually creating a firm bed of resistance to the petrochemical industry in East Texas, at least an international petrochemical industry. We love our Texas oil, of course.
Because it's better.
But that said, we're there now. Tar Sands Blockade is there now, and we're expanding and growing our scope of what type of work we're setting out to do.
Now, two things I want to talk about. First of all, you have had activists who have chained themselves to some of these pipelines. What was one of the things that they said as far as the quality of these pipelines that were about to go into the ground? Right.
TransCanada, the pipeline corporation that owns Keystone XL, and Michael's the lead contractor for two segments of the KXL Southern segment, and there's a third contractor, a third company named Sunland. who's handling the contract from Lufkin south to Port Arthur and Houston. Michaels in particular is thought of as the lead or best pipeline builders, contractors in the country, in the business. TransCanada has claimed over and over again that this pipe is the safest pipeline ever built. On December 3rd, 3 activists named Glenn, Matt, and Isabel climbed into a segment of pipe just outside of Winona, Texas, near Tyler, and they did so overnight. When they woke up just past sunrise, Isabel noticed that she was ringed by sunlight coming in from the outside on a girth. Now, there are 2 different kinds of welds for these pipes. There's a spiral weld that happens in the factory, and then there's a girth weld that connects 2 rods. And she was just happened to be resting on a girth and noticed this ring of light. So she quickly snapped some photographs just as the police were arriving, and a really terrible, violent scene occurred where Matt's arm could have been ripped off when they tried to remove the barricade that he was locked to. The chain that was holding him to the barricade was broken, but the video of it is really horrific and quite traumatizing to watch, hearing him scream in pain.
Oh. Well, speaking of that kind of courage, you have the Tar Sands Blockade has been having some training sessions for other people who would like to be activists. Is that right? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we've done trainings. We've had 3 mass trainings so far, at which each one is escalation in terms of participants. Mm-hmm. We've recently turned our sights to not so much focus on direct action on the KXL easement, on the route itself, partially because we are now injuncted against taking action or trespassing on that due to a SLAP suit, but also because we also understand that people around the country are dedicated to ending tar sands exploitation, and they don't want the southern segment to happen as much as we don't, but we cannot expect people to give up their lives and come down to Texas to plug into a movement and perhaps get arrested in Texas. There are other ways to put pressure on these corporations by looking at their investors and holding them accountable as well. TransCanada's investors are, some of them have very people-friendly and very clean public images. Mm-hmm. And of course, TransCanada's image is anything but clean. The tar sands are anything but clean. So to put pressure on them through, perhaps what would be called free market activism or corporate accountability activism is another way that we can stop the KXL, and people can plug into that struggle in their homes and rise up and defend their homes from their homes at tarsandsblockade.org/local_action. And that's a link right off of our front page. People can go to our front page and just click on Take Action and find more information there about offices locally in their communities.
It's great, Ramsey. So again, it's tarsandsblockade.org for more information. You can always find out what's happening there as well. Just go to their front page and then follow the links from everything else. Anything else you'd like to say to the audience?
Sure. Well, while circling around to our Ecuadorian friends, my tribe, the Biloxi-Chitmacha Confederation, and the Homa Nation and the tribes of southern Louisiana are an amalgamation of many tribes. After forced removal, after the Trail of Tears, the area wasn't highly sought after by the United States, and we were more or less permitted to occupy these areas and not forcefully removed. The bayous didn't hold a lot of riches. That was until oil and gas was discovered there.
Right, of course.
So I relate very closely to the story of indigenous lands being taken for oil and gas exploration without consultation. There are newspaper articles of my grandfather, Sambo Fitch, going back to the 60s, claiming that we're Chitmacha people, we deserve federal recognition, and we deserve to have a say in what's happening, speaking directly to the oil and gas and petrochemical powers that swept into the area and soon unleashed a torrent of environmental devastation that is undoing southern Louisiana's culture as we speak. I believe we're losing 4 football fields worth of land every hour due to sea level rise and erosion, primarily due to the destruction of the barrier islands and the wetlands because of the incursion of oil tankers into the region.
Well, Ramsey, thank you so much for joining me today. I do appreciate it. We've been speaking with Ramsey Sprague. He is a spokesperson and volunteer and activist with Tar Sands Blockade, and you can always go to their website for more information or to their Facebook page. It's Tar Sands Blockade. Thank you for joining us today. I'm here right now with Ramsey Sprague. He's also one of the spokespeople for the Tar Sands Blockade movement, and you guys have been some of the busiest activists around lately. But you're here specifically to tell us a story of your home city of Houma and what happened and why you got involved into the movement. Give us a little background.
Right. Well, I was born in Houma, Louisiana, there for 7 months and organized in the rural countryside and learned about Canadian extraction companies doing some really horrendous extraction policies like cyanide leaching with gold mines. They would take an entire hillside and crush it into a pulp and then run cyanide through it, and the liquid that would come out would contain and having grown up knowing that I was Native American but not being extraordinarily connected to my culture or to Louisiana or my family there, I always just kept my heart very oriented towards the stories I was told in elementary school and middle school. My family is from a little further south of there in a town called Dulac. These are primarily Indian areas occupied by folks like the Houma Nation and the Biloxi-Chitmacha Confederation. My particular familial heritage in the area is Biloxi-Chitmacha Confederation and specifically the Grand-Caillou-Dulac band in high school about American history and where my family and my people fit in. I traveled to Guatemala pursuing closer relationship to the Indigenous here in Texas that I feel by and large speak Spanish. So went to Guatemala to learn Spanish and fell in love with Guatemala to the extent that I stayed